Hello and welcome to the GZERO World Podcast. This is where you can find extended versions of my show on public television. I'm Ian Bremmer, and today we are talking about religion, where it stands in America, and what it means for the rest of the world. That's because the biggest religion story of the year touches both. I'm talking about Pope Leo XIV, the world's first American pope. You probably read plenty about his perfect Spanish, his questionable loyalty to the White Sox, and the headlines he's making in Rome and Washington. But I want to look deeper into how his papacy could reshape global politics. President Trump, for example, has floated the idea that Pope Leo could broker peace between Russia and Ukraine, since Trump can't, and what it reveals about the spiritual moment we're living through in the United States. Because here's the thing, Americans still want to believe. According to Pew, 92% of people in the United States believe in the soul or something beyond this world, but what that belief looks like in practice is messy. Gallup's long-term data shows a steady decline. Religion used to be very important to 70% of Americans in 1965, before I was born. That number is down to 45% today. But the number of Americans who pray daily has held steady in the last 5 years, between 44 and 46%. That's pretty high. And about a third still attend services monthly. The decline has slowed. It might even be reversing. To talk about all this and more, I'm joined by Jesuit priest and best-selling author, Father James Martin. He knows Pope Leo personally, and he's dedicated his life to spreading the gospel here at home. Let's get to it.
The GZERO World Podcast is brought to you by our lead sponsor, Prologis. Prologis helps businesses across the globe scale their supply chains with an expansive portfolio of logistics real estate and the only end-to-end solutions platform addressing the critical initiatives of global logistics today. Learn more at prologis.com.
Father James Martin, great to have you back on the show.
Good to be back.
A little bit of news in your place.
Yep, got a new boss.
Yeah, how do you feel about that?
He's great. I knew him a little bit before his election, and I think he's very open, he's modest, he's humble, soft-spoken, but as one of his Augustinian brothers told me, not a pushover.
Now, you were in Rome at the time of the conclave. Mm-hmm. When it's going on, of course, no one is saying anything. As soon as it's over, everyone's saying everything. What was it like? What was the buzz from people inside, for people talking to folks inside after the decision was made?
After the decision, people were basically scrambling to find out who this guy was. He was known. He was on a lot of people's lists. I would say if you asked me at that time, I would have said maybe 6 or 7, kind of a compromise candidate. But he wasn't as well known as some of the other contenders. So yeah, just people digging into his background. And I think the more they found out, the more impressed people were.
What can you say now that we have a little bit of knowledge about the conclave itself and the decision and the outcome? What can we say about how it transpired?
Yeah, I think what happened was that Cardinal Parolin, who was one of the front runners, came in with a lot of votes at Cardinal Tagle. But it became obvious pretty early on, apparently, that neither of them had the votes to win. And they started to look at Cardinal Prevost, who, believe it or not, because he spoke English, I think appealed to a lot of people, appealed to people from the Far East, for whom Italian isn't a natural language, English-speaking Africa. The Latin Americans loved him because he was in Peru for a long time. And I think people just really respect him. He's a very holy guy. And I think within 4 ballots, he was the man. So it happened pretty quickly from what I hear.
Now, you just said he's a very holy guy. I would think that just about anyone you would pick would be considered a very holy guy. What does it mean for you to say that?
It's someone whose life is centered on Jesus. He's humble. His whole world has been serving others. He's very modest. And I think he's someone who I think that you could see immediately as holy. That's my sense. When I met him, I found him a very prayerful person. And yeah, everybody is in their own way, but he's, I would say, demonstrably so. It's obvious when you meet him, he's a real person of prayer.
And you've spent a fair amount of time with him before he became Pope. I understand you've told me he's quiet, he doesn't say much, and generally a social environment, but he certainly has views. What did you take away from him in terms of kind of things he thought about the church and the role the church should be playing?
Well, he was very much in line with Pope Francis's move towards synodality, which is a way of making the church more inclusive, more welcoming, more listening. But really, we don't have to guess because he's told us in two ways. One, with his choice of name, Leo XIV, which is a nod to Leo XIII, who was the father of Catholic social teaching, so standing for the workers, rights of the poor. But also, he's been pretty open in his speeches to cardinals and other diplomats about what he wants to do, to continue the legacy of Pope Francis, to continue the legacy of Vatican II, to stand up for those who are suffering. So he's been already pretty blunt about where he wants to lead the church.
He's made already some statements, I mean, maybe a little faster than I might have expected for someone just, sort of getting his feet wet in the job, on Russia, Ukraine, on Israel, Palestine. Do you see Pope Leo as someone that is likely to play an active diplomatic role?
Yeah, I think any pope is called upon to play some sort of diplomatic role. He has mentioned peace many times, and so he's, I think, offered, as far as I know, the Vatican as a place for negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. But I wouldn't be surprised if peace and peacemaking and peace building was a part of his papacy. But really, that's every pope. I mean, his first message on the balcony after his election was peace to all of you. So that literally his first words to the world and to the church are peace. So I wouldn't be surprised if that wasn't a real theme of his papacy.
The world is not replete with peace these days. What does the Catholic Church need to do? What kind of leadership should the Catholic Pope play to help change the trajectory that the world seems to be on right now?
I think the first place to start might be within the church. There are different competing factions, and so bringing peace to the church, bringing a sense of unity, which he has talked about. But really, he's continuing the legacy of, every modern pope. John the 23rd wrote an encyclical called Peace on Earth during the Cold War. Paul VI said, if you want peace, work for justice. John Paul was obviously very involved in peace. So was Benedict, so was Francis. So it's nothing new for the Pope to get involved in peace. We want an end to war. The great quote, one of the great quotes from St. John Paul is, war is always a defeat for humanity. And so this has been a consistent theme of popes, and it will be for Pope Leo.
People talk about him as the first American Pope. He's not only an American Pope, of course. Do you think of him as an American Pope, and what does that mean to you?
Well, funny enough, I was corrected a number of times for saying American Pope. They say, well, Francis was from the Americas too. So I guess we're supposed to say the first U.S. Pope. But absolutely, I think he's going to inject new life into the American church. I also think he's the one to really bridge the gap between the right and the left, the progressives and the traditionalists in the U.S. church. I think U.S. church leaders and politicians and even Catholics aren't going to be able to say that the Pope doesn't understand the United States or doesn't understand the United States church. So I think he's going to be a real leader. And it's very exciting. I mean, imagine him going to Chicago, right? Going back to Chicago, going to Villanova. It's actually hard to describe since we've never had it, but I think he's going to be a real shot in the arm for the U.S. church.
I mean, Americans go crazy for any pope when they come to the United States, right? I mean, and that's been true as long as I've been alive. But it is probably electrifying, right? In the sense that not only there are a lot of Catholics, but most Americans, in fact, the vast majority of Americans, consider themselves spiritual.
Sure, and so
90%.
Yeah, and thank God, I would say, and. He's a moral leader just by virtue of the fact that he's been elected Pope. But I think to have someone who can speak English, speaks American English, really removes the distance between Catholics and the Vatican. The Vatican is seen as kind of this foreign, strange place where the Pope speaks with an accent. And even when they speak English, right, it's accented. So I think it just sort of lessens the distance between the average Catholic and the Vatican, which means it lessens the distance between the average Catholic and the church, and therefore God, because people, make that connection. So I think it's a great spiritual move.
When I asked about the Pope bringing peace, the first thing you said was about competing factions inside the church. Brought it back inside. How does it feel? You're obviously on one side of that, right? I mean, you've been very outspoken for a lot of progressive rights and a lot of reform inside the church. How does it feel today, the Catholic Church? What does it mean for there to be conflict inside the church?
Well, it's against what Jesus wants. Jesus says that they all may be one. We're supposed to be a sign of unity, and it's a real pain for a lot of people. And it's a pain for me, that there's so much division in the church and anger. And there was a lot of critique leveled at Pope Francis, which I thought was really unfair. So that was really divisive, I thought. But I do think Pope Leo has the ability and the capacity and the opportunity to really bridge these gaps. I think there are ways that he's already reached out in different gestures to traditionalists and progressives. He's more and more traditionalist, I would say, vesture, right? When he came out on the balcony, he was
traditional.
Wearing the mozzetta and the cross. He sang in Latin, the Regina Caeli.
He's gone back to the papal apartments.
He has, yeah. And yet he's also said that he wants to continue Pope Francis's legacy and continue synodality. So I think there's already, in the first few days, this sense of trying to build those bridges, which I think is fantastic. I think a lot of Catholics are very grateful for that, especially in the U.S.
Where do you think, if there were something that the Pope could do concretely that would make the church feel less divided than it is right now, what would you recommend that he do?
What a great question. In the United States?
You start with the U.S., sure.
I would say just visit. I think he is the sign of unity among Catholics, and the more that Catholics can, in a sense, rally around him. I mean, the real leader of the church is Jesus Christ, of course, but the Pope is a sign of unity. So if he visited, I think it would really bring a lot of people together, because I think both traditionalists and progressives, left and right, liberals, conservatives, would be excited to see him.
Globally?
Globally, I do think this idea of having the Vatican as a locus for peace talks is a great idea between Russia and Ukraine. I think that's a concrete sort of thing you could do in a neutral place. But I also think the way that Francis did this a lot, visiting war-torn places, I think is there's a sense of aligning yourself with people who suffer, which is really where the church should be. So, to visit Ukraine, to visit Myanmar, Sudan, these are very dangerous places, but I think it's a sign of the church being with people who are suffering. And so there's a sense of unity with people in that.
It's almost impossible for a pope not to enter the political fray as much as you want to be above partisanship. We've already seen from his brother, for example, said he's been not happy with critical of U.S. migration policy right now. What do you think his orientation implies?
Well, this is not meant to be glib, but his orientation is the gospel, and the gospel talks about welcoming the stranger. And popes have said this for generations. So he proclaims the gospel, and if it has a political sort of outcome, so be it, I think he feels. The Catholic Church has always been on the side of the migrant and the refugee. Jesus tells us to welcome the stranger. So he's been pretty clear so far, as Francis was clear. And I think the Church is going to continue to stand on the side of people who are the stranger. There's lots in the gospel that might be a little confusing, but when Jesus says, when you welcome the stranger, you welcome me, that's pretty clear.
The American that's been most public in talking about and engaging with Pope Leo so far has been Vice President J.D. Vance, Catholic, has publicly been talking a lot about, well, actually, love thy neighbor. Really, if you look at the Bible, it focuses first on yourself and your family and your community, and then you can talk about other people down the line. That's clearly not the reading that either you have or the Pope has. How public do you think the Pope should be in discussing these sorts of things when he's engaging with U.S. political figures?
Well, sometimes directness is called for. Pope Francis wrote a response to this misinterpretation of what's called the Ordo Amoris, the order of love, which basically was misinterpreted to say that, family first and friends and then neighbors, and then maybe when you have something left over, to people on the outside. That is not Catholic teaching, right? And we are called to care for people that we don't know. I think Pope Francis was clear about that in the letter. I think the Pope and the Vatican decide when to be direct, usually they're oblique. They don't want to be seen as sort of picking fights, right, or responding to individual people. And besides, the migration and refugee crisis is worldwide, so it's more likely that he's going to do something that's more universal. I mean, as I said before, it's the gospel, it's not politics, and they try to be diplomatic as well, to sort of also be neutral.
Is there an opportunity, I mean, when you have an American Pope, which is someone that's advancing, let's face it, soft power, advancing values that the United States historically has wanted to stand for, at least some of them, is there an opportunity for the Pope to bring America back to some of those values? The country is so, you would talk about divided, the country's a lot more divided than the church right now.
That's a great question. He de facto is a moral leader, just by virtue of his office. And so if he can speak in an American accent about values, I think people are going to listen to him. I think that there was a sense with Francis that people in the United States said, well, he's from Argentina, he doesn't know much about the U.S. You can't say that about Pope Leo. And so I think people are going to listen to him more. He's going to have more influence simply because he's an American, and people won't be able to dismiss him as someone who is ignorant of American culture or American politics. So yeah, I think he's going to have a pretty huge impact on the U.S.
Talk a bit about what it means to be a Catholic, to be a leader today.
You mean for the Pope?
No, for you.
For me?
Yeah.
Well, I can talk, I'm not sure I'm a leader, but I can talk about being Catholic. It's hard to say. It's like talk about being a human being or talk about being a man or an American. It's part of who I am. It's a certain way of understanding Jesus. And let me start over. It's a certain way of relating to Jesus through the church and through the sacraments. But I would say it's also being part of a community, right? So it's not simply a series of intellectual assents, right? It's also being part of the larger community, which we consider the body of Christ, and finding yourself in that beautiful, sometimes messy world, that is the church. So yeah, it's hard to describe. It's hard for me to kind of step out of it.
You're listening to the GZERO World with Ian Bremmer podcast, your weekly geopolitical deep dive into the world's biggest news stories, featuring in-depth conversations with global leaders and newsmakers. To get more of GZERO's insights on global politics every morning, sign up for our free newsletter, GZERO Daily, at gzeromedia.com.
As someone who grew up in Catholic school myself, the world is very, very different today than it was when you and I were growing up. Opportunities are different, challenges are different. I'm wondering how you relate to that as someone who's devoted your life to Jesus Christ. Are we farther from him today, generally, as a country, as a nation?
We farther from Jesus?
Oh yeah, are we spending less time engaging with him? Is it more fractured? Is it more fragmented?
Well, I think the United States is getting increasingly secular, right? And so we're moving away from religion in general. I think you could say that about the world. But there are pockets that are growing, and I think there's kind of a natural hunger for a relationship with God. I think that's part of who we are. And so I think if you remove it from people's lives, there's going to be this kind of responding hunger. And I think you do see that today, people looking for a sense of spirituality, if not religion. I think people are more turned off by religion than they are by spirituality. So are we moving away from Jesus? Probably in our growing secularity, but the hunger for God is still there.
So we're not necessarily moving away from the, quote, true path, the right path, in your view?
Oh, I think we are. I mean, if you're sort of exempting yourself from God, you're kind of moving away from the right path.
Well, only in the sense that you say we're moving away from religion, but we're not necessarily moving away from spirituality, from the hunger of what's true, what's right. I mean...
Yeah, I think the danger about spiritual but not religious, which is a popular way of saying it, is that you divorce yourself from the community. And as one Catholic once said, the community connects you and corrects you. So it connects you to other people. It's very hard to be spiritual by yourself. If you're spiritual just by yourself, sometimes the danger is, oh, it's just me and God. And if it's just me and God, then whenever it pops into your head, it's okay, because, I'm okay with God and God's okay with me. A community, I think, corrects you. So, for example, if you say, I never have to take care of poor people, because I'm fine with that. That's what God wants. The community and the history and the tradition are going to say, yeah, that's not exactly what we're talking about. And we'll push you a little bit and we'll challenge you. So there's a correction. There's also a connection. We're naturally social beings. And I think being by yourself with God is it's kind of untenable. You want to naturally be with people and worship God together. So I think that's, when you say spiritual but not religious, I think that's what people are sort of separating themselves from, that correction and that connection. And we need both.
And how is the community changing? The community that Pope Leo now finds himself, sort of the leader of the representative of, how is that community different than it was when you were growing up as a boy?
That's a very good question. I would say the move towards the global South is really important, that the majority of Catholics are coming from the global South now. And so the church, the sort of center of gravity of the church is changing. You could see that just from the makeup of the College of Cardinals, just from the faces going in.
So many of which have been appointed by Pope Francis from all over the world.
Yeah, to make it more representative. He often appointed cardinals who were people from a particular geographic area, not exactly from the traditional kind of Cs, as we call them, like the big cities. So that's one way. But I also think there has been this division in the church between the traditionalists and the progressives, and it can get pretty nasty at times. Now, a lot of people, it doesn't affect them. They go to their parish, they like their priest, they like their bishop, they like the parishioners. But there is this kind of tension, how far can we move and progress, and how much do we need to hold on to tradition? That's kind of been tough over the last 10 or 15 years.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's inevitable. The Second Vatican Council opened the church up to the modern world, right? And there were people who had a hard time with that. There's a value in both being progressive, right? And sort of opening ourselves up to what's going on and learning things and reflecting more deeply on human experience, right? Based on science and, what we know about people. We certainly don't think about women the same way we did 200, 300 years ago. We don't think about LGBT people the same way we did 50 years ago, or African Americans, to take an example, the United States, the way we did 100 years ago. So it's good to progress and think about things in a new way. At the same time, we want to hold on to tradition, right? The values of the church. So that tension is kind of inevitable, but I think people tend to move towards one side or another. And the danger is when you say about the other side, you're not a real Catholic, or you're not a good Catholic. And that, I think, has happened too often in the church. And this is something that Pope Leo, I think, is really well positioned to respond to.
The thing that, does strike me as most unusual, right, is when you see the conclave and you realize he's opened it up to the global South, and it's all dudes. Like every single one, right? And you ask yourself, well, how can, of course, look, all American presidents have been men too, but you say, how can an institution in 2025 call itself representative when literally half of the population just ain't there making the decision?
Yeah, that's right. And that's what a lot of women ask, and that's what a lot of men ask. One of the things that Pope Francis did, which was pretty revolutionary, is when we had these synods that I participated in and that Pope Leo participated in.
And you were at his table.
Yeah, for 2 weeks. For the very first time, we had women there. We had women voting. Pope Francis...
and it didn't ruin it?
No, it made it better.
Okay.
And
so there's learning going on, is what I'm hearing.
Well, right, and that's part of the progression.
Yeah.
And Pope Francis appointed women as heads of Vatican offices for the first time, and Leo has continued that. Just last week, he appointed another woman. So there is movement in that. There is movement in women having, more roles of like real leadership in the church, and I think it just needs to continue.
So do you think, just between us girls here, if he could have snapped his fingers, Pope Francis, and said, okay, let's leave aside all the institutional challenges, but if it was up to me, I'd bring women in right now, make them equal in church leadership. Do you think he would have done it?
Well, he tried to in terms of and putting them in these...
I understand. I'm just talking about completely and truly.
Well, I think Pope Francis also sees church unity as a value. And so there were certain things that he didn't do, I think, because he didn't want to, in a sense, break the church, right? So We saw that over LGBTQ issues, right? He wanted to move it ahead, and I talked about that with him. But he also rightly believes that church unity is a value, and he looks around and realizes that in some parts of the world, in sub-Saharan Africa and Eastern Europe, they're not ready for it, right? And it would, like it or not, break the church, I think, if it moves too quickly in one direction.
The interesting thing about the world today, of course, is that it is moving faster and faster at a time that many institutions, and the church is one of the most important, is, for good and for bad, like really much more stable. I think about artificial intelligence, which Pope Leo actually mentioned publicly early on, and the fact that in a very short period of time, human beings are going to be very different than they are right now, engaged with these new devices, changing who they are as people. How does the Catholic Church respond to the idea that humanity might not be Homo sapiens for long?
Well, the first thing is that there's a real reverence for the human person. I mean, that, human dignity, that's a foundational Catholic teaching, right? I mean, St. John Paul wrote about that very effectively. So that's the first thing. So reverence for the human being, and that includes the person who's the migrant, the refugee, the poor, the sick, the unborn, the elderly. But I've actually been impressed with how on the ball the Vatican has been with AI. They've had a number of documents about it, conferences about it, and it's pretty amazing that Pope Leo would mention this in his first week. Now, Pope Leo XIII was responding with his first encyclical to the Industrial Revolution, and Leo XIV has said that there's another kind of revolution going on. So I would not be surprised if you saw an encyclical or some sort of major writing about AI. Yeah, the key is the focus on the human, the emphasis on the human, so that the human being doesn't just become, like a cog in a machine, which happened in the Industrial Revolution, right? But it will happen probably in, the AI revolution, but in a different way.
You personally have been very outspoken on issues that today many would consider woke. You already mentioned LGBTQ, specifically transgenderism in the United States right now has become, a touch the stove issue. Does this make it feel more urgent for you to lean in on those issues, or do you think actually maybe some went too far in progressivism and need to look towards things that will unify the country and the people better?
Well, it's like the parable of the Good Samaritan. When the guy is lying by the side of the road and has been beaten, we can either pass him by or help, right? And I think that LGBT people, and particularly transgender people, are really being treated like dirt these days in many parts of the world. And so we're called to help them. So I think the more that they are attacked, the more urgent it becomes for us to stand with them, right? It's really shocking to me that, particularly with the transgender community, which I'm not an expert on this, but I mean, it's such a minuscule part of the population. It's become this kind of outsized, almost focus for so many people. And I think what we really need to do is just, accompany them and be kind to them and listen to them. That's the first thing, because many people who are talking about it, I don't think I've ever met a transgender person in their life. So Pope Francis, on the other hand, met regularly with transgender people towards the end of his life, I think monthly. And he didn't change any doctrine on it, but he, met with them as human beings. This is part of human dignity, right? We treat people with dignity. If they're a migrant, if they're a refugee, if they're unborn, if they're an inmate, if they're on death row, if they're transgender. So it's all part of the treating people with dignity.
I was also impressed with his regular engagement, I guess it was every week, with this church in Gaza.
Every night.
Was it every night?
Every night.
Every night while the war was going on. Every night he found time for that, no matter where he was.
Yeah. I mean, he is the spiritual father of the church, and he's the spiritual father of this parish too. And I think just his desire to accompany people really came through. That's what one of the sort of themes of his papacy was: accompaniment, being with people, listening to people, meeting them one-on-one. And I think he did that very well. I mean, that's a very effective sign of his pastoral outreach. He's the pastor.
So in terms of the impact he had on the church, what do you think he'll most be remembered for?
I think Francis will be remembered for the kind of person he was. open, merciful, loving, compassionate, listening, in addition to the more ecclesial things he did, like his encyclical on the environment, which I think is revolutionary, Laudato Si. But I think they'll see in him someone who went to the margins and brought people in. One of his images, which he used at the very beginning of his papacy, was the church as a field hospital, which I'd never heard. And I kept thinking of like MASH, the old TV show where field hospital, people coming in and out.
Hawkeye right there.
Exactly.
See, you got to move.
Well, right.
Yeah.
And taking care of people who are wounded, providing a rest stop for people, calling people in. I think that's a really beautiful image of the church. And I think he was someone who really put that into action. I mean, whether or not it was meeting with transgender people or calling a church in Gaza, right, or standing up for the environment, he's really calling people into this place of welcome.
Father James Martin, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
That's it for today's edition of the GZERO World Podcast. Do you like what you heard? Of course you do. Why not make it official? Why don't you rate and review GZERO World? 5 stars, only 5 stars, otherwise don't do it. On Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tell your friends.
The GZERO World Podcast is brought to you by our lead sponsor, Prologis. Prologis helps businesses across the globe scale their supply chains with an expansive portfolio of logistics real estate and the only end-to-end solutions platform addressing the critical initiatives of global logistics today. Learn more at prologis.com.